preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Tonight I welcome you to our Contemporary Journalism series. This evening's program, Journalism Old and New, has been endowed by the Glanz family in memory of Ruth and Jack Glanz, who considered the Y their home away from home. Tonight's panelists are Jeffery Toobin, author and staff writer for The New Yorker, and author Marvin Kalb. Books by both of these authors are available for purchase outside the hall by Barnes & Nobles. Following the program, you'll have the opportunity to have your copy signed by our guests. Our moderator for tonight is Leonard Lopate, host of the highest-rated local public radio talk show in the country, WNYC's New York and Company. Following the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask our guests any questions that you may have. I believe the ushers should have issued you index cards. Please fill your answers or your questions on the index cards provided, and the ushers during the course of the program will collect those index cards. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Leonard Lopate.
Thank you, Sydney. According to anthropologists, people all over the world share pretty much the same definition of what is news, whether they're on the most isolated island in the Pacific or in the remotest part of the Amazon. They all want someone who can run swiftly over the next hill, accurately gather information, and then relate it in an interesting way. It's obvious that news satisfies a very basic human instinct, so why has the American public come to mistrust and sometimes even hate journalists? Many news people fear that things have gone seriously wrong as well. Well, tonight I'll be talking with two leading journalists who have been among the severer critics of the current state of our print and broadcast media, and I'm pleased to bring them out now. Jeffery Toobin served as an assistant United States attorney in Brooklyn and an associate counsel in the office of Lawrence Walsh during the Iran-Contra investigations, and then he left the often reviled law profession for the much-loved and admired field of journalism. He's the author of books about the cases against Oliver North and O.J. Simpson, the battle between Clinton and Kenneth Starr, and most recently, Too Close to Call, the 36-day battle to decide the 2000 election. Jeffery Toobin. And Marvin Kalb was, for over 30 years, a diplomatic correspondent for CBS News and NBC News. He also served as moderator for Meet the Press, and now he's the executive director of Harvard's Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Mr. Kalb is the author of a number of books, both fiction and nonfiction, the latest of which is a look at the press's performance called One Scandalous Story, Clinton, Lewinsky, and 13 Days That Tarnished American Journalism. Marvin Kalb. Let me begin with you, Marvin. You were a working journalist for over 30 years, but then you retired and became an academic.
Retired?
Well, I retired from journalism.
I don't even recognize the word.
Do you see, as an academic now, do you see your former profession from a different perspective than because you've been out of it for a while? Do you think it's different when you're in the middle of it than when you're out of it?
Yeah, I think that it clearly is different because you're not under a deadline pressure. And so you can look at it from an entirely different way. But I always had the feeling that when I left in 1987, I left NBC, I had a feeling that for a couple of years journalism was leaving me rather than I, having left it in 87. I was then very lucky and got this job up at Harvard and have been up there ever since. What I have tried to do is to teach students of government the interaction of press and politics and the formulation of public policy. So it is very different to write a story every day, and it's very different to try to tell somebody who's going to work at the State Department why is it important to have a free press, why is it important that you deal with the press. Why don't you just forget about the press?
Well, your brother left journalism for a while to go into government.
Yes.
So did he remember that he had been a journalist when he was in government and suddenly...
I don't think he ever stopped being a journalist even when he was in government.
We've seen an awful lot of crossing over. Everyone from Pat Buchanan and William Safire to your brother and many others, Democrats and Republicans. I wonder if you think this is good.
I've got to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I think that my brother is the only one who joined the government as a spokesman, which is what he was for the State Department for a little under 2 years, who resigned when he found out that the U.S. government was lying to the press. I don't believe anybody else has ever done that.
Mm-hmm. Jeffrey, you grew up in a journalistic family too. Is that why you went into law?
Well, yes, my mother is here tonight, Marlene Sanders, distinguished television correspondent. My father, Jeffery Toobin, was a public television executive for many years. And I always said to myself, well, that's one thing I won't do, is become a journalist, because I heard the complaints every night. But I guess it was more... I mean, it's a very interesting way to make a living. I love being a journalist. When you were doing the introduction, I was thinking, I sometimes think of myself as, I've been a lawyer, now I'm a journalist, and sometimes I think I should become a member of Congress so I can do the trifecta of the most loathed professions in America. But there's
Undertaker, and you got
immediate threat of me being elected to Congress.
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No.
Finish your thought.
It flew out of my head.
I just was wondering whether journalists feel misunderstood by people who don't have a clue as to what their jobs entail.
It's funny. I think journalism there is a similarity to member of Congress in that if you ask people in general what do they think of Congress, they all hate Congress. But if you ask people what they hate of journalism generally, they hate journalism. But they actually like individual journalists. I mean, individual journalists, people are reasonably well respected. And I actually I think Marvin and I differ on this, on whether, how far journalism has fallen. I mean, I became a journalist in 1993, 6 years after you left. I think a lot about journalism is better than it ever was. And I think if you are a knowledgeable consumer of news, there is more news available to you than ever before. And I think it's actually a wonderful time to be a journalist. There are a lot of problems.
But you're talking to someone who writes for magazines. It's very different than being in a newspaper. And I had an editor tell me that in the newsroom we no longer talk about journalism. And when he'd begun, they would think about what it all meant in terms of journalism. Now, he said he was concerned about the impact of business pressures and the bottom line.
See, yes, the business pressures, there is this sense that business pressures never existed in the past, which is hooey. But this is an extreme example, but the New York Times. The New York Times is a better newspaper today than it has ever been in its history. It is a better newspaper than has probably ever existed in the history of the world. And that is not a trivial thing. It is also read around the country when it also used to be read in New York. Now, it used to be read exclusively in New York. Now, I think that's something to celebrate. I think that's something great. I mean, the internet is a resource that, while, imperfect, is a tremendous boon to news consumers. So, I mean, yes, there are terrible bottom line pressures. There's a lot wrong with network television, but I think there's really a tremendous amount good out there as well.
Marvin? He said you probably disagree.
I think I do, yes. I think I do. What is this called, journalism old and new?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Well, that's an excuse.
I think I represent the old, clearly. And when I say that, I mean it not just in terms of the gray hair that I've accumulated, and he is just beginning. He's just beginning to. That's because he's only been in it now for 8 years.
That's true.
He'll pick it up soon enough. But my sense is that I always tell this story to try to give people an understanding of the role of money in journalism. When I started at CBS in 1957, it was assumed that the news business, news at CBS, at NBC, was a lost leader. Nobody expected them to make any kind of money, and they didn't. And I remember Bill Paley saying to a group of foreign correspondents at the end of 1962, he outlined for us all of the wonderful things that he was planning for 1963. And Charlie Collingwood got up and he said, "Bill, that's going to cost you a lot of money." And Paley's answer, which I remember as a direct quote, it was, "You guys cover the news, I've got Jack Benny to make money for me." And what that meant at that time was something I think that is terribly important. If you have the news, to Paley represented a cloak of respectability and legitimacy and authority. And he was no fool. He could make a lot of money, and he did. But he always understood that news was important for two reasons. One, that cloak, and two, it had something to do with the public interest. More broadly speaking than just profit motive.
But Bill Paley pretty much destroyed Edward R. Murrow when he caved in on pressures because of McCarthyism. Edward R. Murrow wound up just doing person to person and was pretty much eliminated as a newsman. Even then, there were all sorts of pressures. Maybe they were more political than economic.
I would argue with you about Murrow's demise in the way in which you describe it. I joined CBS in 1957. I was not aware, really, until '58 when Murrow did a speech in Chicago in which he spoke about television as being nothing more than a box with wires unless it can inform people. And I think that that concept of television being an instrument primarily for education and public interest in policy is something that really is gone right now. Because today, as Jeff knows and you know, and I think 99% of the audience knows, today, if a program does not make money, it's just going to be dropped, or the anchor will be dropped, or the executive producer will be dropped. And money is determinate. It is the dominant force. It is the ratings and the circulation. And I have a feeling that if Jeff did not work for a magazine which had such a brilliant editor and keep the New Yorker where it is up front.
Which doesn't make money either. Yeah,
which doesn't make
at the moment. But we're getting there.
It's not at the point of losing the kind of money it was.
No, it's
before.
not losing. That's right.
Because when you begin to lose too much money, you're out. And what does that say then about the public interest? It doesn't say terribly much. Nobody cares about it.
It's interesting that CBS is where it all changed because Don Hewitt says that 60 Minutes is what led to the expectation that a news program would make a profit.
I think that Don has a very large ego, and that's an illustration of that.
I think he's, but on that, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, before then, there was this expectation that news was a lost leader, and 60 Minutes came along, and it was this rip-roaring editorial and commercial success, and the executives said, well, if you can have both those things with 60 Minutes, that's what we want with news divisions as a whole. And as you developed leadership in all of the news divisions that did not come out of journalism necessarily, that expectation developed. I think it's important to remember that this period of sort of news as a lost leader in network television is a relatively brief period in the history of all journalism. I mean, you're talking about, the sort of early days of television to about 1980. I mean, so maybe you're talking about 20 years, 1960 to 1980.
It started a little before that.
Well, a little before that. Okay, but let's say 55.
48.
Well, 48. I mean,
well,
not many people had televisions in 1948.
No, but by 52, an awful lot did, and by 56, most people were watching conventions on television.
So we're talking maybe 30 years instead of 20 years. I mean, other than that, journalism has been a business that sustains itself for profit. And, I think as participants in the capitalist economy, we have to recognize that we're either going to have to we have to be responsible to sustain ourselves or we won't exist anymore.
But Jeffrey, aren't you at all concerned when the news division of an entertainment conglomerate promotes one of its parent company's products, and that's what we're
I'm
seeing
concerned.
a lot. The whole synergy thing that has led Disney to want to own an ABC, and
I think there are worse
AOL
problems
and
than
Time Warner
synergy.
to own so many different stations.
There are worse problems than synergy. I think the cross promotion is not a huge. I think the pressure on earnings is enormous. There's one thing to expect the news division to, make a profit, but when you lump the news division in with expectations to have double-digit profit gains every year, which is what, before the recession anyway, people expected from all divisions of major companies, that I think is unreasonable. I don't think that news can be an ordinary participant in just another division of Disney or Viacom or whatever. But I do think that if journalism is to sustain itself, it has to have some relationship with the market that that will allow it to survive.
Marvin, you wrote that several questions emerged when you tried to understand exactly what went wrong from a media standpoint in terms of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, and were led to ask, how did the new economic changes in the news business affect copy?
Directly, dramatically, depressingly. Sure.
You wrote, and I'll add to that, it took only a few days in January 1998 for journalists to realize that they were in uncharted waters, faced by a scandalous story, a competitive 24 hours a day news cycle, and a coldly demanding economic imperative. Many found themselves violating just about every rule in the book.
Yeah, well, I think that's pretty well borne out by the evidence. Remember that the Monica story, when it broke in January of '98, was the first major story that was being covered not only by major newspapers, the magazines, et cetera, but Fox had come on board since the previous major story, MSNBC had come on board, and the internet had come on board. So a major story, and I love Frank Rich's term, which is a mediathon, he calls it. It is an overpowering event. It becomes inescapable. It's as if nothing else is taking place in the world. We are totally dominated by a single story. And as I said, there's no escape from it. If you try to find something else on the news, you will fail. It isn't there. And when I say that journalists violated an awful lot of the rules that they knew they were doing as they were doing it, what I had in mind was this phenomenon, which Jeff has written about, which I called it the out there journalism and the in here journalism. And there's a wonderful, wonderful story which I tell in the book about Ellen Weiss, who's the executive producer on NPR of All Things Considered and a number of other programs. She was being pushed by her producers to go with the Jennifer Flowers story because they told her out there and we had to do it. And she had a great line on that. She said, it's out there. That doesn't mean it has to be in here. Well, that's marvelous. If you're at NPR, you can pull that off, and she did for one day.
And when Dan Rather tried to do it,
they tarted it up at NPR.
Well,
Bob Edwards was in the gutter.
No, I don't quite think that. I don't think quite that.
NPR is not.
but when Dan Rather tried to do that with the Gary Condit
And what
Levy
happened?
story,
what
they
happened to
really
the
went
ratings,
after him,
though?
didn't they?
That's right.
You know what? What happened to the ratings? Not much.
Nothing.
Nothing. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
But everybody went
No, but
after him
the
and
reason
said,
he did it was that he thought that out there were an awful lot of people who really would have preferred his version of a more serious newscast. And so, as you well know, they didn't run anything.
absolutely.
Right.
And he was
But
right.
he didn't get the people out there.
yeah, but he didn't lose anybody either for not covering
he
the
lost
story.
a couple, but he didn't lose many. NBC ran it almost every night. They gained. So that there is an appetite for that kind of news, and if it is provided to the public is going to watch it, eat it up.
So is the Lewinsky...
So by the way, I
Clinton-
haven't fully answered your question before,
Well,
but we'll go on.
we have some time, actually. Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, on the one hand, can be seen as a sexual thing, and all of this has to do with titillation and exciting the public. But it also has a political side, and Jeffrey, your book was called A Vast Conspiracy, your book on it, taken from Hillary Clinton's A Vast Right-Wing Conspiracy. You did leave the words right-wing out.
I did.
Was it a press right-wing conspiracy?
No, I don't think so. I do agree with Marvin that a lot of what went on in the Lewinsky story was pretty appalling from a press perspective. You know, I'm in a position here of, I mean, I love the Lewinsky story. I mean, I don't want to apologize for the Lewinsky story. I mean,
People
this was one of
accuse
the
you of trying to have it both ways.
Well, that's right. And Tina Brown, my first editor at The New Yorker, had a phrase she used a lot, which you know, I happen to believe that you know, the best stories are high and low. That there are qualities that you know, that, I mean, we had impeached the president of the United States. That is a serious phenomenon, fact, event under any scenario. We impeached him because of this ridiculous affair he got involved in and then lied about, so, which was comic and low, and so I enjoyed both aspects of the story. I fully admit to that. But I do think that, I mean, what the competitive pressures that drove the story, especially in the 13 days that Marvin writes about in his book, I mean, did lead to some really appalling journalism, and there were financial incentives more complicated than just, you know, this news division had to make money. I mean, there were, I mean, as I wrote in my book, I mean, there were several people involved in the story, whether it's, you know, Linda Tripp or Michael Isikoff, who works for Newsweek, and since Mark Whitaker didn't show up, I can make fun of him in his absence.
Oh, we were going to go after him if you were.
Oh, good, okay. But I mean, these people were determined to write books about Bill Clinton's sex life for, you know, for a suspended period of time, and that was a financial incentive that drove the story as well. I mean, there were a variety of financial incentives at work. Well, beyond just the profit motives of the corporations.
So this is not just a scaife kind of press story.
No,
this is really the Washington Post competing with the New York Times.
Absolutely. And my book was called A Vast Conspiracy very intentionally not to echo. I mean, it was meant to refer to but not repeat what Hillary Clinton said.
But it is true that both of you talk about Michael Isikoff, but also the whole thing in the Washington Post, I almost said Washington Times, the Washington Post, who was his boss? The guy who
Barbash? Fred Barbash?
Is it Dottie? I have it down here somewhere.
Who are you talking about?
Isikoff's, was it Isikoff's boss?
At the Washington Post?
Yeah, when it started, he was at the Post, wasn't he? No?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
The story started right there.
Yeah, Leonard Downey. Leonard Downey, who saw this as his opportunity to beat the New York Times and have his major journalistic coup.
Karen DeYoung, who was one of the senior editors at the Washington Post, believed at the time, and she told Isikoff, that for Len Downey, this was his Watergate, that Ben Bradley had Watergate, and now Len was going to have. Now,
he didn't see any difference
about that. I asked Len about that, and he absolutely categorically denies it. And there are any number of other people at the Post who also deny it. But at the Post also at that time, there was a special group that had been put together, and they were going after the story full bore.
And remember, the story then was Whitewater. It was not, no one knew about Lewinsky. It was Whitewater, which, you know, years later, you know, I sometimes like to, you know, ask for a show of hands. Can anybody even articulate what the Clintons were accused of doing in Whitewater? You know, a scandal so bogus and
But that was the Times.
ridiculous.
That was the Times story.
Well, it started at the Times, but it was not a. It was pursued with greater vigor at the Post.
And I think that's the key point here. Mm-hmm. The Times broke the story of Whitewater, but then it was a year or two before the Post really got into it, and Downey was reluctant at the beginning to get into it, but Isikoff kept pushing that story. And then Len Downey was an easy guy to persuade because Len liked that kind of a story. And then he said, okay, go ahead and do it. And then Susan Schmidt began to be involved in it. And then he set up this task force. And then Karen DeYoung began to say, well, Jesus, 6 months of doing this story, we've done about 56 stories on this. And as Jeff is saying, there wasn't that much there at the time. So what is it that's happening? So she translates it as Len wanting his Pulitzer Prize and would focus on Whitewater. But the fact is that as this story began to develop, it kind of segued into sex, but by way of a number of sleazy characters and lawyers representing Paula Jones, and then a succession of lawyers representing Paula Jones. And it turns out to be a kind of interesting but terribly unappealing mystery story. And one of the things that got my curiosity going on this was that I wanted to try somehow, if for nobody else except my students, I wanted to try to explain how a story happens. How do you come upon a story? What gives it legs? Why does it have legs?
And I think, and the story you tell in your book illustrates that I think it's not just money that people are after. I don't think Len Downing...
No, I never said that.
No, I know, but just when you talk about how journalists screw up, it's not always because of the profit motive behind the corporations they work for. I think there was this competitive frenzy in the Lewinsky story that was driven by the ego and pure competitiveness that was not necessarily financially motivated.
No, if I said or wrote, I didn't intend to do, and I don't think I did. It never, and you know this, it is never a function of a reporter sitting down and saying, my boss is going to earn $2 million if I do it this way, or $1.5 million. No, that's not the way journalism works at all. What I was trying to do is to explain underlying causes that create an environment in which certain decisions are, produce certain results and others don't. But the idea that an individual reporter is thinking about, I'm going to make more money if I do it this way. Maybe some of them do, but that is not what drove the story.
Well, I was curious about some like Jackie Judd, who comes out of NPR, who obviously has a strong sense of what journalism is, and then she's on ABC, and she breaks sensational stories based on dubious rumors, especially the one about an eyewitness catching Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky in an intimate encounter in a private area of the White House. Nobody's ever really come along and said that that was true, but it was in the news for a long time. Now, this is not some hot young reporter. This is Jackie Judd, who was on All Things Considered. To me, that makes her an important person. I work in public radio. So I can't, I think that there are...
I think it's a very good point.
We think that people in public radio have a higher standard. So something else is going on there, and if it isn't money, it is glory, or it is the competition, this fighting for the team. ABC has to beat NBC.
Well, there's a
CBS.
lot of ABC has to beat NBC and CBS, sure. There's an enormous amount of competition. But you work in an environment. Look, at ABC, what they were doing is having a series of meetings a series of meetings every day, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, New York, Washington, wherever Stephanopoulos happened to be, maybe wherever Toobin happened to be.
I was at a lot of those meetings, actually, yes.
Well. They were all sharing information that they had. And it was Jackie's story to do for World News Tonight. So she was up front, being the voice and the face for all of the information that people behind her produced. And there were a lot of people behind her with interesting contacts into people like Linda Tripp. And so you end up reflecting, where does Linda get her story from? She gets it from Monica. Monica experiences something. And she also was rather proud of talking about the fact that she fantasized a lot of her life. Well, maybe some of this was fantasy, maybe it wasn't. And I would take my hat off to Newsweek magazine for not going with Isikoff's story when it did not go with it on that weekend of January 24/5. But the Jackie Judd story is a very important one, because on January 25th, which was a Sunday, she did that story on This Week. And what was interesting, that was also the day of the Super Bowl. So in the middle of the afternoon, an hour or so before the Super Bowl actually begins, Brokaw breaks into NBC programming with a bulletin in which he speaks about what? He speaks about what was on ABC. That is not normally what Tom does. He doesn't like to do that, but he felt, and he acknowledged this. He told me, it's all written down. He told me he felt that he simply had to do it. It was out there, it was too sensational, but the New York Times didn't go with the story. Stephen Labatin and John Broder of the New York Times thought they had on Sunday morning 4 sources that they depended upon. Joe Lillyville, the editor here in New York then, was ready for a banner headline to put across the New York Times on Monday morning. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, these 2 reporters came in to Michael Isikoff's office, bureau chief then in Washington. Oreskes, thank you. And they said, Mike, of our 4 sources, 3 of them heard it from the 4th. And that was Joseph DeGeneva, a Washington lawyer. And so they said, we can't go with the story because it's one, and DeGeneva overheard his wife, Victoria Townsend, another Washington lawyer, talking to a possible client about this. Having overheard it, he then passed it on. Why does somebody do that? You do it because in Washington, and I guess elsewhere, it is your open sesame toward invitations onto television programs, getting mentioned in the Times and the Post. It's part of the culture of journalism and the uses and misuses of journalism.
I'm the ABC News legal analyst. Jackie Judd is a colleague of mine, and I think that it is a very damaging story that you tell in the book about that. I think it is also possible that people make mistakes, and that in the height of a competitive story, that she made a mistake here. She also took a lot of grief about. She was the first person to report the semen-stained dress, and everyone said, "Oh, what a myth! It's now ridiculous." Turned out there was a semen-stained dress, and she was right about that. And I don't defend that story, but I do think in the context of what is a difficult and difficult story to cover in general, because a lot of the people who know are not willing or able to tell you.
Oh, come on. The OIC was leaking that every hour of the day.
The last thing I want to do is defend the OIC. I wrote a whole book about how awful they were, but I don't think their leaking was quite as extensive as was sometimes.
The reporters I talked to were very explicit.
Okay. But if the New York Times passed, a lot of other newspapers didn't. In fact, one of the real changes we've seen in journalism is that newspapers now report stories that are broken on television. It used to be the other way around. In fact, TV, during the election of 2000, TV pretty much drove all of the newspaper coverage. I don't remember whether the New York Times did it, but many other papers didn't. One even had a headline that said something, networks, Bush wins.
Well, you're talking about the projections?
Well, whatever. The point is that TV now drives newspapers. And if the Times didn't do it, that was an exceptional case. I guess the story was just too big. But many newspapers followed TV's lead on all of this, didn't they? And then once it was out there, and once even Matt Drudge said something, it was news, whether it was real news or not.
Yes, I mean it was. I think there is actually some critical judgment that is applied by newspapers. Sure. I don't think that there is wholesale repetition of what. I mean, I am a dedicated reader of the Drudge Report. I mean, I read Drudge Report every day.
Is he still alive?
Oh, he is. He's alive and well and living in Miami now. And he does, it's interesting. There's a lot of mythology about what Drudge does. Mostly what Drudge does is repeat what other people write. He does almost no original reporting himself. The story that made him famous, the leaked story, the story of Issakov's report being killed by Newsweek was really an aberration in terms of what Drudge does. And he has said in a wonderful moment of candor, he says that he believes that what he reports is about 80% correct, which I love. It's just,
That's when he was asked whether he's a journalist, and he said, no, not really. He said only about 80% of what I write is true.
But he, I think, I don't know of a single, other than that very anomalous situation that day, he was not relied on as a source. People did not sort of wholesale repeat what he.
They put him everywhere.
They used it for
Matt
leads.
Lauer would call him a right-wing kook and then put him on the Today Show.
But he had information that was good information. He really did. He had sources in this story that were good sources, and
They were extremely. They were part of the conspiracy you wrote about.
Right, absolutely. They were involved in the story.
They were passing on information which they were determined to get out no matter what.
That's right.
They had failed with Newsweek, and they would go with Drudge.
I have to tell you, every day I get about 10 faxes from a number of groups, mostly conservative groups, but every so often also liberal groups, that have fax for me, which I just eliminate from my fax machine because I really don't do that kind of show, but also because I recognize that I don't have enough time to check. I don't do that. There are a lot of people out there who are doing talk shows who just take these things off the fax machine and say, I have a reliable witness here who says, and then they repeat this thing on their show.
It is amazing. There is a whole universe of talk show facts. I'm in the middle of a book tour, traveling around talking about the Florida recount or the whole recount, and you Rush Limbaugh. I appear on a lot of programs that are sort of sandwich Rush Limbaugh, so he has a lot of viewers who listeners who don't much care for me. And there are certain facts that come up over and over again. Just for example, one that is interesting to me because it's completely fictional, but it is repeated over and over again, is that one fact about the election is that Al Gore received more votes for president than anyone in history except for Ronald Reagan in 1984. That's just a numerical fact. But Limbaugh has said repeatedly that there are 1 million absentee votes in California that no one ever bothered to count. And in fact, if those were counted, Bush would have won the popular vote. It's false on so many different levels. There are not 1 million votes. Gore won the state by such an overwhelming margin that it probably would have increased his lead. But you're right that there are these. One of the interesting implications of having the internet around is that there are these sort of parallel universes of reality that start to leak into the quasi-real world.
Well, let's talk about that election. We can go back to journalism in general and Clinton, Lewinsky. Was the coverage really bad? I'm just talking about the election itself. Or was it just the night where the networks goofed on projections? Or was it as bad as 1988, which you have said in the past was the worst ever? Have we been seeing a steady decline, or was 1988 really terrible and then
Well, in my view,
2000?
1988 was terrible, but it's not my view that's important. It's the view of the participants in the election. The candidates themselves said it was one of the worst elections they've ever seen, and in one case anyway, participated in. But I have spent most of the last 15 years just analyzing the press performance on political issues. And in the 2000 campaign, looking primarily at what television did. and for reasons that I think are valid and that are written up in detail in One Scandalous Story, is that journalism simply has changed, and to speak about it as the same pursuit of truth and the public interest and all that stuff, I think is just silly, because the evidence is overpowering that it has run in the other direction.
A Shorenstein study, this is your organization, shows that during the last presidential race there was a dramatic increase in the number of stories without any public policy content, from 36% in 1980 to 52% last year. Coverage of candidates had tended to be more negative, 25% in 1980 to 63% in 2000.
What was the negative thing? What?
From 25, coverage of candidates had tended to be more negative. I don't know what that means. 25% in 1980 to 63% in 2000. I guess it's journalists feel that they have to go after candidates now, or else they're not doing their jobs.
Well, I mean, the evidence is right there. I mean, they spend more time now taking apart candidates than explaining candidates. Back in 1968, for example, on the CBS Evening News, ABC, and at NBC, there is 48 seconds of uninterrupted speech would be typical. Now, of course, when Hubert Humphrey is running, you need at least that just to catch your breath. But no, seriously, you get 48 seconds in a row. Uninterrupted speech was the norm. And by 1988, 20 years later, it was 8.6 seconds of uninterrupted speech.
No, the sound bites are definitely shorter. Although, I mean, I am a reasonably careful watcher of evening news programs, and I don't think if you were a conscientious viewer, you were uninformed or even significantly less informed.
That's not what we're talking about.
Well, no, wait a second. About whether where George Bush and Al Gore stood on abortion, on tax cuts, on the military. I mean, I don't think it's a different profession. I really don't. I mean, I don't think people sit around with motives and with techniques and with plans that were significantly different from the reporters who were covering the 1968 race.
Why don't, if you were to sit down, if we had right here the executive producers of the three major newscasts today, and the executive producers of the same three broadcasts from 68, 78, 88, choose your election, you'd find a different story.
I think you'd find different
story.
They tell a different story, and they tell it in
the
different
music
ways.
Is the same.
Well, they tell it different ways. You're also it's a different world. I mean, in 1968, there was no such thing as CNN. There was no such thing as Fox or MSNBC or C-SPAN or the internet. So I think there were different outlets available for people who were interested in this.
Prove to me that with all of these additional outlets, the American people today are better informed about the things that they ought to know about than they were back then.
I mean, can we certainly? I can't prove
the fact
to you
that there are more networks does not in any way mean that they're better informed. There are, if you go down,
and that's the network's fault. I mean, the
well,
fact
that's what
that
the networks
won't,
put on the air.
Well, but people, I mean, who choose to be interested citizens, who choose to be participants in the democratic process, have a smorgasbord of choices available to them, and so is that all the network's fault, that the networks aren't?
The networks today are governed by people who are not the same people who governed the networks 20 and 30 years ago. At that time, there were people who were actually news people in that business. Today, there are businessmen running it. At ABC, there's a lawyer running it.
Yes, sir.
David Weston is now the one who runs and determines.
Very
things.
familiar.
Okay, good.
Well, let's go a little further. Let's talk about what's happening at this very moment in the press. We have Condoleezza Rice asking the networks not to run anything from Osama bin Laden. There are people who feel that that's really denying us important information. Ari Fleischer has appealed to newspaper editors not to publish the full statements. We had Britt Hume of Fox, used to be of ABC, saying journalistic neutrality is not an appropriate concept to apply to coverage of current American military actions because this is a conflict between the United States and murdering barbarians, rather than one between institutions of some comparable quality. We have the TV stations saying that they can't find critics of this war, and others saying, well, we can, but we don't want to put them on because the public gets too angry when we broadcast them. Are they living up to their journalistic standards?
Well, let me give you
I know that was a long question.
2 answers on that. One, when Condoleezza Rice called, the networks almost immediately capitulated. They said, yes, whatever you say, boss, that's it.
Why?
Okay. And since that time, in my judgment, and I've done none of the kind of research that you were citing a moment ago, this is just impression, but my impression is that there is a large degree of self-censorship that is now being absorbed by the press corps. And one of the reasons for that is this overpowering sense of patriotism, of an open wound that is still very much in the process of healing. And people feel raped. They want to do something about this, and they want to express their feelings of outrage. So it's terribly difficult, and I'm extremely sympathetic on this point. It's terribly difficult if you're sitting up there as an anchorman to do almost anything other than cry, because you are sharing your personal emotions. You're up there. And there are times, by the way, this is the other side of me speaking, there are times when emotions cannot be controlled. I remember when President Kennedy was killed, and Bill Small, who I think is here somewhere, was Washington bureau chief at that time, and I had a feeling that I ought to go into the bureau immediately, but I think I'm telling this to Bill for the first time now. I walked around the block twice, around the State Department twice, before I went in to work, because I knew if I were to go in immediately and try to broadcast, I couldn't quite pull it off. And I have a feeling that Rather and Brokaw had that same experience. I think Jennings is much more the tighter lip type. I think it's very difficult not to show your emotion.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with having a point of view about whether, it was about the World Trade Center getting bombed. I mean, I think it is a perfectly appropriate journalistic reaction to say this is an outrage, this is terrible, this is indefensible. This is not a story where you are obliged as a journalist just to simply give both sides of the story.
What's the other side?
Well,
But there are people who feel that the conduct of this war.
I think that is bizarre, frankly. The whole desire to keep bin Laden off American television, because I think, for one thing, he hasn't been exactly successful in recruiting the broad mass of America behind him, to say the least.
He's not interested in America.
But I do think also
he is being broadcast on Al Jazeera where he wants to be.
What I kept thinking about when I heard about this Rice story was that during World War II, if we had had the opportunity to see Hitler broadcasting or to see Hitler talking, it would have been of incredible value on many different levels. I mean, you would want to know, how he was motivating his troops, what he was arguing, what he wasn't, where he was acknowledging weakness, where he wasn't, and the idea that just not to look at it and not to show it just seems counterproductive if you want to run a successful war. And I do think that, I think Rice was correct that it is not a good idea the way the networks originally did, was just to broadcast, 15 minutes unedited Osama bin Laden, but to treat his statements. The cable people did that. Well, and actually, I think the networks were still. I don't think CBS, NBC.
Really?
Well, to treat what bin Laden says as news is entirely appropriate, sure, because it is news. But I do think, her suggestion was at once not not wrong, but also somewhat counterproductive.
Well, let's get back to this whole thing of what goes on and what doesn't. You start off by your book by talking about seeing somebody being brought in to John Kennedy, and you knew there was a story there, and you didn't imagine ever pursuing it.
The quick telling of that is that in September of 1963, Kennedy came to speak at the UN, as President Bush spoke there just yesterday, and he stayed at the Carlisle Hotel, and about 11 I was going in to have a drink, or at least to meet with some other reporters at the small bar on the Madison Avenue side of it. And I saw two Secret Service agents standing in the small vestibule. And as I approached one of them, whom I knew, he looked at me in a panic, knocked me to the ground, and two other Secret Service agents escorted a rather attractive blonde into the elevator and up to the president's suite. And what I write in the book is that 38 years later...
Her name was Jennifer Flowers, by the way.
When I think about that... when I think about that, I never for an instant thought that that was news.
Well, were you right? Because what we know about Judith Exner, for example, that was a scandalous story.
It sure was. He was in bed with an East German agent.
Yes.
That's an even more scandalous story. Yeah, but it wasn't news. What do I mean by that? It wasn't our definition in the early 60s of what news was. The idea that somebody could be, that the President of the United States could have an affair. 5 out of 10 reporters in Washington had heard something about Kennedy. But at the same time, whoever the wise men were at that time decided that this was simply not news, that the private life of a president would remain private, as it had been for
But you know,
many
if Richard Nixon had had an affair, that would have been news.
Jimmy Carter, Harry Truman.
But the thing is, you know, when you make decisions about what's news and what's not in this area, I think you have to take another step. I mean, I completely agree with Marvin that it wasn't news. However, let's say he thought it was news. Let's say he decided to follow up on that story. Well, what would you do? I mean, what would you do? You would do perhaps what the Miami Herald did to Gary Hart. You know, you sort of stake him out and watch who was coming and going, or you would try to find out who this woman was, and then look for your very own Linda Tripp. See who she confided in, you know, see who, you know, this woman confided in, and then find that woman. I mean, it is an incredibly degrading process for those who choose to get involved with it. And my solution, I mean, what I wrote about is just don't. I mean, I recognize...
But we did it with Jennifer Flowers, didn't we?
I didn't do it. I mean, I don't think that was... I don't think it was appropriate. And yes, you run the risk of missing the East German spy, back when there was such a thing as East Germany, you know, that the president is having an affair with, and you miss the, you know, mob mole that he's having an affair with. But, you know, to me, it's worth
But you know, with Kennedy at that time, there were so many people around who knew of his womanizing, so that if you were actually, if you wanted to engage in that kind of reporting, you could have come up with the story.
But do you think that...
But even if you had come up with the story, that didn't mean that anybody would put it on the air.
Partly because people had a different attitude about Kennedy, or it was just a different time?
Well, it's a different time. A different time. The new definitions of news change with the times.
I also think, I mean, you put your finger on a point that is worth teasing out a little bit, which is, you know, people's ideas about a candidate. There is a very powerful conventional wisdom, particularly about certain people and about certain subjects. And I think the fact that Clinton had this reputation, had more or less, had admitted that, you know, he had caused problems in his marriage in the past, that sort of created open season on him to a certain extent. And other people, there has been less interest in pursuing their background.
Just one more thing before I go to these questions here. When
when the Lewinsky testimony became public, every pundit went on television and on radio and announced that Clinton was toast. He was out within 3 weeks. And much has been made of this disconnect between the press and the public's reaction to this. All sorts of explanations have been given. Do you have any sense, first of all, as to why they were so out of touch with what was going on in America? And second of all, just what all this pundit thing is anyway, these people predicting what's going to happen tomorrow when your guess is as good as mine.
I have a deep distrust of polls on issues involving sex. A deep distrust. I think that people simply don't tell the truth. And the other thing about this impeachment business, when the Washington Post story broke, and it's on your doorstep, say at 5 o'clock in the morning, by 7 a.m. on ABC News, Sam Donaldson was talking about impeachment on the morning that the story broke.
I was on that show.
Now that, I know you were. I didn't,
I know
I didn't
you were.
mention you.
No, I
didn't mention
I've read
you.
the transcripts.
Yeah,
Thank
but
God.
all I can tell you is that sounded to me, I mean, utterly outrageous to leap ahead. You didn't even know that the story was right. It could have been dead wrong.
Well, my colleague
Go ahead,
Calvin
defend it.
Trillin
Go.
has a phrase. You know, the Sunday morning shows he refers to as the Sabbath gas bags, and I think you could do a lot worse than simply betting against whatever they predict on those programs. My favorite now is, you know, they're all talking about, you know, the internal politics of Afghanistan and the Pashtun. And like, if one of those people had heard of the Pashtun 2 months ago,
Right.
I'll give you $500 right here on the spot.
What?
Now, but it is. You know, and it's not just sex. They're wrong about everything. I mean,
And then they get raises.
Well, I mean,
John McLaughlin, I remember him predicting that Ross Perot would not get more than 5% of the vote in the first election he was in. He got 19%. He told all the other guys in his panels that they were idiots. Well, he's still on television, isn't he? He probably got a raise.
You know,
Only every week, though.
one of the big, I mean, in Too Close to Call, one of the problems I attribute to Al Gore is that he listened far too much to those people. I mean, there was an unforgettable, to me anyway, story by R.W. Johnny Apple in the New York Times on, I think, the Thursday after the Tuesday of the election. And the lead was 1 week and no longer. It's like, you know, the public will tolerate uncertainty about the presidential election for 1 week and no longer, or, you know, all hell will break loose. Completely wrong, completely preposterous. The public had much more patience with this story. We had a president, we had a process, but Gore was fixated on the Washington establishment view that he had to wrap this up really quickly. He couldn't ask for a full recount, and I think that view is, you know, invariably wrong.
So what you're telling me is
there's
that
a
the politicians read the newspapers and
There's
they...
a very important point there, and your question fits right in there. They not only read it, they worship it. You cannot exaggerate the value and the importance that the Washington establishment, and here I don't mean just politicians, I mean a whole lot of very senior journalists and lobbyists and lawyers, the group. You see them at parties, they're all over the place. And they, if Tim Russert brings you on to Meet the Press now, you have arrived. You are a politician, you are talked about. I mean, how do you get talked about? And I think that what we're trying to explain here is not just, what I'm trying to explain here, is not just a process of journalism. Journalism itself is hard enough to understand. It's a process of power and politics in which journalism now plays a central role as they are players.
But the good ones, some of the good politicians, know to ignore that world.
For example, George W. Bush. George W. Bush did not agonize about what they were saying on Meet the Press. On Meet the Press and in the New York Times editorial page, they were saying this has to be an orderly process, this can't be political, it has to be legal. And Al Gore said, oh yeah, that's right, Jesse Jackson, stop holding those rallies, we don't like those at all. George Bush was saying to James Baker, you do whatever the hell you have to do to win this election. And James Baker said, get those people out in the streets, get the Miami Cubans energized, get the young congressional aides down there, and I don't give a damn what the New York Times thinks about it. And,
what about the Supreme Court justices you also talk about? Do they worry about what's in the newspapers?
Well, I think they worry a little bit, but I think they care more about getting the right candidate to win. And so, they wrote this opinion that, which is not even defended by people who defend the result. An opinion so incomprehensible and ill-reasoned and just unwise that is just appalling to anyone who has followed legal matters.
Let me respectfully disagree on the George W. Bush thing. I think George W. Bush is as obsessed about what is on television and what is on the front page of the New York Times and what the op-eds are all about as any other significant, successful politician. For example, on the night, which Jeff knows very well, on the night of the election, George W. spoke with his cousin, John Ellis, who was one of the decision makers on the Fox Bureau here in New York. He spoke with him 6 times. Now, I know that he likes John very much, and I know that John likes George very much, and they are close first cousins. But come on, they had to know, they wanted to know, and they were intent on influencing, to the degree that they could, exactly what went on the air.
And John Ellis was the first person to declare George Bush the winner.
Yes,
Fox
he did.
was, yes.
Fox was.
But Ellis was the person
made
behind
the
that.
vote.
Yes, he did it.
Okay. How about some questions from this audience? What do you think of Joan Didion's view that Washington journalists no longer put the story together? All their reporting is based on finding a contact and reporting its views.
Well, there's something to what she says, sure. I don't think that's exactly the way it works. I mean, it may work on occasion that way. I think more than anything, it works if we go back to the Jackie Judd example, which I think is a much more accurate one. It is that sometimes reporters are given a story. They are the ones who are going to write it. They're the ones who are going to voice it if it's television appear. But there are a lot of people behind her or him, a lot of people. And in any number of cases, a journalist may reflect one person's view, but I think quite often it's a reflection of a whole broad opinion.
Well, in the case of Michael Isikoff, his pieces were very much opinion pieces. In fact, he's not alone in that. A study by another organization, Tom Rosenstiel, is that his name?
Rosenstiel.
Tom Rosenstiel, they decided that 40% of the New York Times news is opinion rather than just straight news, but never identified as such. A lot of opinion pieces.
The New York Times is a lot more analytical than it used to be. I mean, they don't do just sort of straight reportage. The president said X, Y, and Z yesterday.
Okay, but Michael Isikoff, when he does that in Newsweek, and he's making decisions and offering his own commentary, is that Michael Isikoff or is that Newsweek?
I think you would just the when you were covering a contested story like impeachment, I mean, it is my operating assumption as a reporter that approximately 100% of the people I interview have some agenda with me. And that's fine. I mean, as long as you know that going in, it doesn't mean you don't report what they say, but you try to use your own critical facilities to sort out, where the truth lies and all that. And I think that's true in most. I mean, the whole institution of public relations exists to get reporters to say things that people want said. And that doesn't mean you don't report. It just means you try to exert some critical intelligence. I think, people vary in their skills, in their motivations but I mean, I think that's a slight oversimplification of what Joan Didion said, but it is true that.
Well, when you
most
broke the
people
Mark Furman story,
When I broke- yes, indeed.
you were being given that information by people who wanted him to be discredited.
Absolutely, and I wrote the story just to refresh your memory from those halcyon days of OJ.
And as a result, OJ is now fighting road rage
and
cases.
that's my fault.
Of course, it's
No.
all your fault.
So what was interesting about the road rage trial is that he seemed actually to be innocent of that, which seemed shocking to me. But
I don't think he's innocent of anything.
But no, it was clear to me. I mean, just to take you back, the Simpson defense wanted to portray Mark Furman as a racist who planted the glove behind the house, and I learned that they were going to make that argument, and I wrote it up in the New Yorker, but I also wrote about what an implausible theory it was and how they had motives to, exploit the Rodney King case. And so I was perfectly happy about the context. I mean, I was lucky enough to work at a magazine that allowed me to put that thing in context, but I was also delighted to break the story.
It was a great story.
Thank you.
In the end, now I'm not sure that this statement will be agreed to by both of you. In the end, journalism depends on objectivity. What are the consequences for public confidence in the profession of the military, NATO, Pentagon management of the news, Gulf War, Kosovo, Afghanistan, as part of war strategy?
Well, there's no question that the Pentagon attempts to control the flow of news during wartime.
But do you think that news has to be objective?
That's its job, by the way. It's not doing anything it's not supposed to do. It's supposed to win a war, it's supposed to follow presidential instructions, and it's supposed to galvanize public support. And so, sure, look, if at the end of a week of solid lying by the White House, they found the person or people responsible for the anthrax, and the president announced, there are the 3 guys responsible, we have just arrested them, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry. I deliberately lied to you this week because that was part of our strategy to get those 3 people who were involved in that kind of war. I would have applauded the guy. In theory, no, I don't like being lied to. But in wartime, Winston Churchill said, the great quote from the Tehran conference, truth is so precious that she must be guarded by a bodyguard of lies. And I don't know that that should happen all the time, but I fully understand it happening sometime.
But they haven't arrested these people.
They have not.
Right.
That's
But-
absolutely
Just want to
true.
make that point.
Maybe they're telling us the truth.
By the same standard that, I shouldn't be talking about the Pashtun, I don't want to be perceived as a great expert on how to cover a war. But I do think there remains a great question in my mind, and my colleague and hero Seymour Hersh is writing stuff in the New Yorker that I'm not reading anywhere else. I mean, I don't know what the heck's going on with this war. I mean, I'm not filled with confidence that there is that we are getting much true reporting out of this war, not because reporters are lying, but just because there's just not. Now, it may be.
We don't know that.
What?
We really don't know that.
We don't know. And I don't know. And
it could be that Seymour, entertain the possibility that Seymour Hersh is wrong.
Absolutely.
He's been wrong before.
He has. He has. But I do think that the management of the news is such that it is so extreme that I have doubts. Now maybe I do understand that wartime has different rules, that it's simply too risky to allow journalists proximity to what's really going on. But it's also true
Look,
that you don't know what's going on.
Journalists can go and cover the war. They're there right now. I read a story in today's paper from Kabul. The journalists have been reporting from inside Afghanistan now for a couple of weeks.
But we don't. For example, there are American troops. We don't know how many American troops are in.
But why should you know how many are in Afghanistan?
But on the other hand, there was an article in
seriously, why
today's
should you?
Times that pointed out that if you watch the BBC or ITN, you're getting a very different picture from the journalists who are in Afghanistan than you are from American journalists. They have a much harsher view of how Americans are being perceived. The American journalists are sending back feel-good messages. Now, I don't know which ones are right.
I am sympathetic to the view that we should not be reporting troops. The classic thing you learn in law school about what's an appropriate prior restraint. You can't talk about the movement of troop ships in advance. That's when there were troop ships. But for example, just Cy Hirsch's story last week about this raid that took place. We saw all the cameras there
What cameras?
The military released photos of the troops coming in and out. Now, it was reported by the Pentagon that this was an enormous success. It was reported by Hirsch that it was in fact quite a failure. I don't know what the truth is. God knows I wasn't there. But it just seems to me that kind of reporting, I'd like to see more of it. So maybe if Cy's wrong, then we'll learn that.
No, but Jeff, where was Seymour Hirsch?
In Northwest Washington.
He was in Cleveland Park in Washington.
Yeah, exactly.
He was speaking to some of the soldiers who went in
and
there.
He was not speaking to any of the soldiers who were involved in that activity. He was speaking to people who had been involved in other special operations in other wars.
No, he was talking to people who were in the chain of command in this story.
In the chain of command, anybody is in the chain of command at the Pentagon.
Is that a bad thing? Is he doing a bad thing by reporting?
I'm not saying he's doing a bad thing, but I am saying it is bad immediately for the American people who assume that the Pentagon is lying to you.
I don't assume that.
No, but there was an assumption, an underlying assumption of what you're saying is that there's Seymour Hirsch and there's the Pentagon.
No, I think what Jeff was saying is why aren't more reporters looking into these things and proving Seymour Hirsch wrong or right, pursuing the story the same way that nobody really followed Watergate for a long time, a lot longer than was really, to the point of embarrassment until finally they had no choice, and then suddenly everybody got into the feeding frenzy.
Sure, and the idea that in theory more people ought to be out there looking at the news and asking questions, absolutely. I'm involved in an effort now in Washington to try to facilitate a better relationship between the Pentagon and its spokespeople and the Washington bureau chiefs. And I think we're making a little bit of progress, but it's never going to be a happy relationship, and especially in war. And I think that most of the bureau chiefs are very well aware that they're not going to have reporters with the special operations people. And so when Seymour Hirsch comes in with an article written from Washington, having talked to X, Y, or Z, whoever they are, who knows, I don't know.
Well, let's move on to the next question. How does someone like Aaron Brown suddenly emerge as a major commentator? I guess we could also say
right place at the right time.
And then there's Bill O'Reilly and there's Chris Matthews, with whom I'll be speaking next week.
Those
are
very different categories.
I just want to get in the plug about Chris Matthews with me. Bill O'Reilly somewhere down the line here at the Y with me.
Aaron Brown is an anchor man. He was a good colleague and friend at ABC, and he literally his first day of work was about September 11th. And it's just that, as he said, perhaps not the way he wanted to articulate it, but I think he said in The Observer, I'm the biggest beneficiary of September 11th. And we are all, we don't want to be perceived as, profiting from tragedy. But look, journalistic careers have always been made out of tragedy, and Aaron is one, and he's also terrific. So.
Do you perceive any bias in reporting by the major outlets? How in touch with mainstream America are major journalists today? And then there's a lot of crossed out stuff, so I'm not sure what he means or she means specifically.
That's an interesting question. A lot of thought has gone into this one about whether the Washington Press Corps, which is the single most coddled and probably the best press corps in the world, are they connected to the American people? Their work connects them to the American people, but are they themselves? Probably not.
They live within a very small
live in a small environment.
group, and often they hang out with the
school and all that.
politicians a lot more than they do
Yeah,
with the general public.
In bed with, but I still have a feeling, I'm not sure what you do about that. I mean, I can go along with the criticism. I've joined in it a few times myself, but I don't know what you do about it then. What are you supposed to do? Move Washington to some small town outside of Philadelphia, perhaps, and report the government from there? Would the journalists know more by having nothing to do with the politicians?
I think if you were to ask, 100 top reporters, if you could force them to answer the question, are you pro-choice, are you pro-life? Probably over 90% pro-choice. I mean, I think there are certain ideological similarities. However,
And that's why they call liberals.
Well, that's right. But I also think it is, they know that too. And in many respects are tougher on Democratic politicians because of that. So I think the question of bias is more complicated than just, they're liberal, they want to help Democrats. I mean, one of the things when I'm on book tours, you often get questions like that. Isn't the media biased? But you often get it, depending, if you're on the Rush programs, I mean, they all think it's liberal, and when you're in audiences, I don't mean to ethnic profile, but perhaps like this one, everybody thinks that the media is sort of pro-establishment and pro-Republican.
I don't see that many Muslims out here. What ethnic profiling are you talking about?
Just a lucky guess, or perhaps, I don't know. So, anyway.
Well, it is true, whatever your political leaning, the media are obviously biased, and depending on how you want to tell the story, you could say that the people who own the newspapers and the television stations are overwhelmingly Republican and conservative, and you might say that the reporters who work for them may be overwhelmingly liberal, although I've met an awful lot of fairly conservative reporters.
I'm not even sure that's accurate anymore, and I think that Jeff's earlier description was accurate. I'm not sure it is today. I think it's much easier, and careers are made much more quickly by being on the conservative side of the political spectrum than being on the liberal side.
Well, and there is now an entire network for the red states, Fox, which is
There's an irony there.
Explicitly ideological.
And they went after CNN for being too liberal, and now CNN is making adjustments. I don't know whether they will finally, after all, they've done very well because of September 11th, but they keep on getting these bounces, and then they almost die, and they need a Gulf War, they need a terrorist attack.
The CNN numbers, by the way, and all of the numbers for the cable operations have gone down quite significantly since the week or two or three after September 11.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, CNN was running 7-point-something Nielsen ratings, and then now it's at 1.1 again. So they're right back to they're about 0.5% higher than the norm prior to September 11th. So they're still higher, but they're not
0.5%, just 0.5%?
0.5% higher than they were prior to September 11th.
So what does this say? David Halberstam has written a book about how Americans really are not interested in foreign policy because we have a kind of inherent isolationism, even though we are the dominant world power. Is the interest in what's going on in the world just a very temporary thing now that we know where Afghanistan is finally, and does that satisfy us?
See, Len, I don't think that the American people are again interested in the world. They are interested in this war because this war is an extension of the attack on the United States. Interest in the world means a lot more complex kind of reporting than we're doing right now.
Well, why don't we do it? The people who really care wind up watching the BBC or ITN, but even there I found a headline that said, Daljit gets her hair cut. So, we're doing to the anchor of this British service the same sort of thing we do to our own anchors, because many people were obsessed when Dan Rather got the buzz cut.
The BBC right now, and in the last 10 years, has begun to go down in pretty much the same territory as American networks. They are.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the British broad, so you're getting a British point of view, just as you get an American point of view.
But you get more international news. You find out
absolutely, because
what's
They're a
happening
lot
in,
closer to other countries.
Precisely.
Yeah.
but they also report on Peru, and they
Yeah.
report on Africa
absolutely.
and Asia.
I mean, it is no coincidence that all the networks have shut down bureaus basically all over the world, and I do think that this is a temporary phenomenon linked not to genuine curiosity about Afghanistan. They just bombed the World Trade Center. I mean, they did something so monstrous and so, directly impacting us that's what this is about. It's not about curiosity about the world.
Some years ago, CBS was talking about merging its foreign news service with CNN, and there was a big outcry. It didn't happen. Do you think that would have been a good idea?
I don't know if it would have been a good idea or not, but I would not be surprised if it happens, not necessarily with CBS, but perhaps with NBC, perhaps with ABC. They have been in negotiation with CNN, but CNN itself has undergone such a profound change since the beginning of those negotiations that CNN may not want to have that kind of a deal right now.
Well, CNN is also going to, CNN, now that it is part of, again, you have a charismatic, eccentric
America Online
founder like Ted Turner, who wanted a 50-part series on the Cold War, regardless of how many people watch, and who wanted bureaus all around the world. And now, AOL Time Warner does not share those values, and you are going to see the same. Now, I think their niche, they will recognize, is to have more foreign coverage, so they won't cut back as much as the other networks will, but they will cut back, and they have started already, or at least they did before September.
But that kind of economic analysis that you just gave,
yes,
contradicts some of what you were saying earlier on.
That's
the whole point here. It is the environment that you have just described with
Right.
Time Warner and AOL, and the effect that kind of union has on CNN's news is exactly the point.
It is certainly, it is true that the new CNN will reflect more the market forces at play, not just the eccentric vision of Ted Turner. However, I don't think that's a death warrant for CNN.
No.
But I,
The old CNN, old new journalism.
Right.
Well, we'll end with this one. What is the ideal journalism, or what is there an idealistic way to handle stories? Is it possible to function in some kind of a pure journalistic world? Would anybody watch it, read it, listen to it?
I'm always entertained to listen to my colleagues at The New Yorker complain, as journalists are wont to do. And I, often think to myself or say to them, if you ain't happy here, and it's like, forget it. There's nothing else out there. I really do think that we're very fortunate at The New Yorker. We have resources, we have a wonderful outlet, we have space to write.
You have fact checkers.
Fact checkers to save us from ourselves. And I'm not pretending The New Yorker is any kind of ideal, but I do think that there are lots of places still where you can do very good work in journalism, and I think a lot of people do it. I think if you're at the New York Times, I don't think things are bad
there's
there.
any question about that. There are still magnificent journalistic institutions, and there were great journalists still running around. I don't think there's any question about that. It is simply that my personal vision of journalism is perhaps too idealistic, but I like to think of it, because I believe it, as the ultimate guarantor of a free society. If we have a free press, a vibrant, good, solid press, we're going to have that kind of society. And if we don't, we're going to suffer the consequences. And so it's no great pleasure on my part to be critical of the press. Far from it. I love journalism and I love journalists. It is simply that when I see it going the wrong way, it pains me deeply, and I think that journalism is now so important, so powerful an institution, that, like the government, it should be subjected to critical analysis as well.
But do you think that it has become so addicted to the kinds of ratings boosts that it gets when there's a Lewinsky kind of story or a Chandra Levy kind of story?
Or a war.
Well, a war is another thing, you know.
But is it another thing?
Well, the difference is that a war, we didn't ask for that, but the Chandra Levy, Gary Condit
didn't
story.
ask for it either.
No, and she still, as far as I know, she still hasn't turned up. You know, but the coverage had nothing to do with that, and it went on and on and on over the same 4 bits of information because something else was going on. They're addicted to the ratings that kind of thing brings, and I suspect that after this war is over and after we talk about the importance of a free press for democracy, we'll go back to that stuff.
I'm afraid we will.
On that happy note.
On that happy note, I want to thank Jeffery Toobin and Marvin Kalb. Thank you all. Thanks to all the people here at the Y and to Emily Hoffman. And the authors will be signing books outside, taking up the opportunity to say hello.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.